report has the same icon as the resources. I'm going to push this up. But you can already get to it. Okay, let me bring the screen, my browser window over. Okay, so we're now on the reporting module. This reproducible reporting with R for marine ecological indicators, and this is going to take a slightly different approach with really just reviewing a few techniques that I think are most interesting related to the automation of reporting. And let's just start with, really I only have one slide as an inspiration, and then we're going to go into the lesson, which is really reviewing some techniques for how to do this stuff. And the one image that I just wanted to share here that I found very inspiring, dated back to a book from 2013, was this reproducible research with R and RStudio. And on the cover of the book, they had this sort of this file system for any given research project. You can have your data, and then your analysis, and then your article, and your presentation, your website, a slideshow. And really this is the idea, is that you can take just the combination of R, that's your code, and Markdown, that's your formatted text, and then render all these different products. And at the very beginning of this training, I pointed to an R Markdown video, just a 1-minute video that described the panoply of different output formats. And let's just go over just a few of them in the lesson today. So this lesson is really not a lesson as much as here's pointing to different formats. And I'm going to go over how these get generated and created so you can do it on your own. And I'm still playing catch up. I've been doing a bunch of traveling, and I need to go back and fill this out quite a bit more. But what I'm going to do is go into my R3 exercises and go over some of these things. But let's just go over these basic objectives, which is we want to understand our Markdown basics. So there's this yet another Markdown language as the front matter of an RMD, and we've gone over that. We also saw that language in this site YAML, and later you'll see this language when we use it to configure a GitHub action. So this yet another markup language is very useful, most commonly used to configure a bunch of variables that can be hierarchical, kind of like a JSON, if you've heard of JSON, but even more stripped down. So it's really great for setting up configurations, like for what what options you want for your R Markdown document, or what options you want for rendering your website, or what options you want for rendering your document with a GitHub action. And then these cheat sheets are gold. There's a few actually on R Markdown. So I would highly recommend using those. And what's also really nice is that only recently in RStudio, there's a visual markdown editor. So that means that you don't have to know all the syntax. You can actually just use this WYSIWYG toolbar. So what you see is what you get, is what the WYSIWYG stands for. And then you can add bulleted lists and highlight text and add a link to that text. And then it handles behind the scenes the text version of that formatting. So you can alternate between the visual editor and just the raw text. And really the reason that that's so powerful and commonly used is because it's both human and machine readable. So there was a lot of issues with generating reports, let's say in versions of Word as a .doc. And a .doc is a binary Microsoft format, and as that version, as they kept on adding new features, some of those older versions would become unreadable, and so that's actually what a docx is. It is that it's an XML-based format for Word files, and actually all the Microsoft Office outputs are docx because they got a lot of flack for creating unreadable documents in those binary formats. And really all that is to say that having these machine and human readable formats, especially where you can see line-by-line differences, is extremely useful as we version code and collaborate. And so far I've mentioned showing R code as chunks. So use the fenced, like 3 backticks, and then you have lines of R code that get evaluated within the next 3 backticks, and you specify with a curly brace what kind it is. And you can actually do just a simpler form with a backtick, R, space, and then some variable, and it'll render that within your text. And what's nice about that is that you can actually have, let's say, you have a highest performer region and a lowest performing region. You don't have to know the region, but you can actually write the text that says such and such, the highest performing region scored such and such, and that's inline R that you can use to render that. And it's nice to know how to. I'm going to go over all this stuff, but I want to kind of say it, and then we'll visualize it, and then I'm going to focus in on a few tricky things that I think are kind of interesting. So when you're in RStudio, there's all kinds of little helper ways to navigate within your source code. So there's a little table of contents in your sidebar that you can expand and collapse to go to different heading levels. There's even a chunk drop-down. You can label the chunks of code and then quickly navigate to those. There's a little gear icon that allows you to specify options. And, of course, you can insert chunks and run chunks. And then you can render equations. We haven't gone over that. Tables. You can add references and have different styles for the bibliography and your inline citing, depending on what journal you might want to publish to. And really, a lot of this rendering of these different formats is done under the hood by this little utility program called Pandoc. And Pandoc, it's made in this language called Haskell, but really you don't need to know any of that. The point is that you'll see a command run, and it's actually sending your source code to a Pandoc binary on your machine to then do some intermediary outputs, and then that's what actually handles different formats like docx and PDF. So sometimes that's useful to know because there are some Pandoc specific arguments and little tweaks that you can do to things. And so when you're looking at different output formats, obviously HTML is good for the web. A lot of folks don't feel comfortable editing in GitHub and dealing with Markdown and these, much nerdier formats that we're going over. So what's nice is that you can also render as a docx, and then that allows you to share it with, say, let's say a manuscript with colleagues, and then they can do some track changes and send it back to you. It still would then be your responsibility to look at those track changes, and then if you want to continue the authoritative source being in some sort of R markdown, then you'd have to go and change that yourself. There's not a nice seamless way. There's been some attempts, but nothing worth, I think, directing you towards just yet to go from, like, say, somebody's docx directly back to an RMD automatically. And then similarly with PDF, that's nice for archival and for like a pretty output report. So, and then there's some common options that I'll show too about the table of contents, how you can change the different levels, and you can have it floating, and then you can also have those chunks of code. You can have them not show at all, or you could have them toggle with a little button that either hides or shows the chunk of code. And then there's this other thing called BSLab, which is Bootstrap Lab, and that's the most common set of components, Bootstrap, when looking at like these menus and buttons and a lot of the common form look of the web. And so there's newer versions of Bootstrap, and this BSLab can handle a lot of this consistent formatting and theming between looks if you wanted to have a consistent color scheme applied throughout your website. So that's just something to be aware of. It's a little bit more complex a topic. So really, I'm going to try to point you towards a lot of different possibilities here. And there's some excellent resources that I'll post, especially with our RStudio webinars about diving into each of these details. But I wanted to really cover a few things that are less commonly covered elsewhere. So, and specifically related to things like ecological indicators and automating some of these reporting format outputs. So let's just look at here. There are these are just the native R Markdown output formats. There's a lot here. There's these different article types. HTML is the most common type that we've been basically rendering. There are these distill. That's a slightly different type articles. There are all these different types of presentations. I'll go over one of them. Book down, websites, blog down, package down. There's just a lot of different formats, and that's not everything. So we're going to go over just a few of these different formats today. And I'm going to talk about how to generate some default outputs and then some of the tweaks made here. So this website, put this in the chat. So that link got messed up. This website is an example of just a simple R Markdown website, and so the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Program has these different regions, and there's the Alaska Marine Ecosystem region, and they have this website which allows you to see the data here, and then you could actually click on a given indicator and then plot it. And this is using some PHP to render this output. And I thought this would be a nice just sort of data set to play with in creating a reporting interface in a few different ways that demonstrates some of the, I think, more interesting and advanced features of what you can do with R Markdown reports. So here's something that we've gone over already, a data table, but there's actually a slightly different, there's a grouping extension that I used here for that data table. And then I made these cells are actually links, and you can click on that link, and then you go to this dedicated web page for that indicator, and then this is a digraph, which we've gone over before. And then you can zoom to that digraph. So that's the same data, but now displayed in this different way, and it's applicable to all of these indicators. So there's this cool thing called a parameterized R Markdown report. And this is also demonstrated in the early on, that first lesson, the R Markdown this is awesome R Markdown. What is R Markdown? And it's on Vimeo. So in this, their little example that they had with this one is here, where they basically alternated between Hawaii and Florida with this parameter that gets set at, when you go to render it. And I wanted to show how you can actually use that functionality. So I'll add this into the chat as well. And the direct URL, because it's there. So, so the way that this gets generated is with a parameterized R Markdown report. So you can, in the YAML, this front matter, which you see is denoted by these 3 bars at the top of your R Markdown, you can add a params. And so because this is indented, that means it's params, this is a parameter, year, region, print code. So, and we can actually render using a template. We can render a whole bunch of pages using those parameters. And that's how all those individual pages that we saw here get rendered. So I just want to go over how that is done. And then also a very cool technique is to be able to render this automatically. And that's done with this thing called a GitHub action. And so I just want to give the broad overview, so because this is more of an introduction to what's possible than a cookbook of, this is how you do A, B, and C. So in these are my R3 exercises, and I had a one-liner that I used to install. There's a use this and use a GitHub action, and I'll go over that in a minute. But what it does is we can set up an action, and we can see that it basically goes and runs the whole whatever script action we set up, and it in this case can go and download the latest data and then re-render the entire website with all of those outputs. And what's so cool about this is that it's actually spinning up a machine for free and installing all the software and then rendering this website. So we can see that this is actually, it's setting the working directory, then sourcing this R script to make the data, and sourcing this other R script that we made called make pages, and then rendering that index, that main table. So that is really powerful pattern for being able to update data from source data sets. If you have R code that can run within an hour on a very, simple stripped down machine. This is a very simple machine, not a lot of memory, and there's about 1 gig of free storage. So if you have nice and tidy data to go and scrape, you can then update this with whatever frequency. So those are the two techniques I really want to highlight here in rendering an R Markdown website, which we've been doing with our previous lessons. And then there's this other format here called a dashboard, which it looks nice. It's called a flex dashboard. And what you can do is you can similarly, it doesn't say the right name, but this is the dashboard. That's the source here. Gosh, messed up that link too. Put it in the chat and then go to this. In this case, here's a dashboard where we took those different regions and then put them, arranged them vertically. So here's the North Pacific Index for the Eastern Bering Sea. Here's CS extent. Here's Euphausid biomass. And then we have this Western AI, Western Gulf of Mexico, these different regions. And there's this other kind of cool trick where with digraphs, if we can group graphs and even synchronize where we zoom into. So let's say I know that the warm blob happened around like 2000, between, let's say, I'll span the years that it happened between 2012 and 2018. And now we can zoom in there. And then these also, all the other plots zoomed because we grouped them. And then this is a different page. And because this is actually all a single HTML output page where all the data gets sent and all the graphics are synchronized, I can host this on a website as a dashboard. And this data is fairly minimal, and it works. It synchronizes between all of our plots. So that's also kind of a nice thing for an indicator, is to be able to do that. So I want to show how to do that. And the technique here is kind of interesting. So this is different than generating a unique HTML page, which we did previously for this website, and we used a parameterized report to do that. In this case, we want to basically append each of these plots into a single R Markdown document with the information about the index and the data and then the plot. And then we build up that single dashboard into what we see here. And so let me just show you actually what the source of this looks like so you can see what I'm talking about. So here, this indicator, it's as simple as we have the name of the indicator, we read in the data, and then we send it to digraph, and we just have the group have the same name as all the other ones. So this is extremely minimal code, but it's a template, really. And what happens is we can iterate through all of our indicators, and we've seen this curly brace used with glue. And there's this little function called knitter, is the underlying knitting library that allows us to then expand on those variables and substitute those variables. And then we can add the name and then add where it's going to get the data, and it'll add them indicator by indicator, and then eventually build it up into what we see here in this index.rmd, which is here we now see that expanded into the indicator name, where that data comes from, and then we output to the digraph. There's another little trick that to then, whenever there's a change in the group based on the input table, or a change in the region, we add another higher level header. So this is a heading 1 with a hash space, and then this is a heading level 3. And if you have row-wise and column-wise orientations, there's a second level header that you could add, but we're not really worrying about that. And so while I'm just cruising through the source of this, let me also cruise through the source of the website to show you the difference there with its template. So when we had this website where each indicator had its own page, so this is generating its own dedicated HTML page, that's using the parameterized R Markdown technique. And if we look at the source of that, here's the indicator RMD. Here we have these params, and then these params here is where it gets substituted based on the params. So, and we can iterate through all the indicators, and when we go to render, update these guys accordingly. So I'm going to show you more detail with that. But these are the two basically very different techniques depending on what you want to do. One is parameterized reports. In this case, we're rendering each indicator into its own dedicated page. And that works pretty nicely for that. If we want to build up a single R Markdown document and use a template in that instance, then we can use this knitter knit expand. So that's kind of nice there. So I'm still trying to give a high level overview of this stuff, and I know it's a little confusing, but I wanted to give you a flavor of these different outputs. And now there's a lot more that can be done. So I'm just going to show example output. Oops, got the wrong link again. So here's that proper link for the book. And an R Markdown book is quite cool. because here's just the default book. And you can render that as PDF and doc, and then see that. This little hamburger gives you the menu. You can even search through the document. So a lot of the documentation for R Markdown outputs is actually in this R Markdown book output format. And so there's a couple tricks here, but you can see here's an equation that we're showing there. And looks like there's a problem with this figure getting rendered. But you can add references as well. And you can have these different formats. So this would be a PDF format of that book. So this is just the default book. But that's an excellent format. And then you can also do slides, and this is, so I'm really getting, this is rather annoying. Keep on the wrong links there. And with this Zaringen package, you can, these level 1 headers can separate slides, and then you can show code and its output and equations. So equations in R Markdown have these $2 signs, and then you can use LaTeX style to format these equations and plots, and you can render tables. Cable, we've been using data table, but Cable works for Word document and PDF formats. And you can even have interactive widgets in your slides. And yeah. So the output type is, again, you can specify in that YAML in the front matter. And then the last one I'll just mention is that you can have output articles. And so if we look at what that looks like, so this is just the default output article, and this is formatted for Elsevier, but there's other formats, and this is using the articles package. This is Zaringen package. There's the Bookdown package, Flex Dashboard package. So there's a bunch of packages for all these different output formats with the same common R Markdown approach. So let's go now. We're going to dive into a little bit more detail and try to walk through some of this. So let's just look at, I'm going to create, eventually this is what I'll add instructions about creating, which is just your own website, dashboard, book, and slides and report. And to get started, we'll just, and maybe just a simple, we'll do a simple web page, which we've basically already done. And we'll just do a plain report RMD. So I'll do a file, new file, R Markdown, and oops, I guess this would be report test web page. Yeah. So file, new file, R Markdown. and we'll just show a few of these RMD options. So I'm going to choose the default output format of HTML, but you can also do PDF or Word, and you can do multiple output formats too. Here's some of those presentations or slides in HTML, or Beamer is a PDF format. There's just tons of formats. You can even do a Shiny R Markdown document from here. And then depending on which packages you have installed, here you'll see different templates available. So here's where you see the package name, the R package name, Flex Dashboard, here's articles, and you can use any of these templates. Let's just do a simple RMD with options. And this we've already done. I'll call this report dash web page because all my other report outputs were called that, and it defaults to RMD extension. So here's the front matter. It's the YAML. If I go to then knit this, here we see that here's the title, the report with RMD. Because this is already in a it's already in an R Markdown site. There's an underscore site YAML. So there's this file here. It recognizes that it's going to add this navigational menu at the top based on that site YAML. So this is where we have our navigation for our exercises. And we can do is add a few options. So if I look for the R Markdown formats and then go into this HTML formatting page, and I'll add that in the chat, the URL to that, we can see that there's a few options that they talk about here. So we can further modify the HTML document rather than just being the default. And probably the easiest way to do that is to go into this gear icon and look at the output options. And then here we can say include table of contents. And yeah, we can number the section headings. And yeah, let's go with that. So what we see is that it modified it rather than just being the default output HTML document. Now it's saying here are some options on that HTML document. So when we knit that, now we see that it's numbering it based on these headers. So that's the second level header. And then you can also see some common ones that I like are with the table of contents. You can add a floating table of contents. So right now it's just 0 and 1. So let's see if we add make this heading 1, and then maybe this is heading 2, and then it's another test. Again, some other heading level here. And we can make this a floating table of contents by just adding that option. And now you see that this floats, and then it even shows you where you are in that navigation. So that's pretty useful. It does take up this sidebar of real estate, but then if you're on a mobile device or something, it'll change the layout to being at the top. Yeah. So that's good to know that there are a bunch of options. And then another common option that I use is the code folding. So especially for tutorial-like things, you can default to hide the code. So before it was displaying the code, and now you get a button to show the code if it is echoed back, show all code. So because this plot, see this, echo is defaulting to true, and then here we set it to false. So if we turn this on to true, renit. So this is the fence code block, and in the curly braces, we're telling it to use R to evaluate it, but it could be Python or SQL. This is a label called pressure, and then these are the other arguments. So you can also say warning equals false, and there's all these other options, or we can default that to all of them with this initial chunk that gets added. So it's not going to show this, but it will evaluate this chunk, and this is where you can set these options to default for the other chunks. And so you can navigate here by chunk. So it's showing us the header levels and the chunks. In this case, they're labeled cars, and you can see that chunk label. And then we can also turn on here this little table of contents viewer. So that's a nice handy thing. And then even handier is this visual guide. So now it's actually showing us that this formatted text, and let's say I want to add a link. Actually, I can select this and then just click on the link and then say, give it a link. And OK. So then that adds a link, and I can add bulleted lists and say A, B, C, and then just select this and be a number list or an unordered list. And yeah. So this little WYSIWYG is kind of nice for doing that. You can add different heading levels too. So this is heading level 2, and change that, especially as you get oriented with R Markdown. And of course, there's also tools, or excuse me, help cheat sheets, and there's this R Markdown cheat sheet or the R Markdown reference guide. And a lot of these cheat sheets, I think they were, the visual editor is fairly new, so probably doesn't even mention that. But yeah, and knitting with parameters, and this is a great reference for understanding correspondence between Markdown and how to format things. Yeah, and doing tables, etc. So it's a big topic, and it's a bit of blitzkrieg, what I'm showing. And so I just wanted to give you flavors of things to do. And let's go back and look at what else I was wanting to cover. So we've covered that. And with equations, it's pretty straightforward in that you can say $, and I could say E equals, and it's showing me MC, and then exponent 2 MC squared. So that's how we can do the equations, and that's the visual editor way. If we weren't in the visual editor, it would still show you the equation here from the raw Markdown. Tables, it's good to do just use, if you have the data set, it's best to just, like if we want to look at this pressure data set, I can maybe insert another chunk and say knitter table pressure and see what that looks like. And a very simple table. for any output format. We could also take a table. Let's say this is in an Excel spreadsheet, and it'll do a different format if you copy and paste. See, I don't remember. See, there's an indicators. Let's say I have this. I can just copy from an Excel spreadsheet, and RStudio at least is smart enough that you have to be in this format. Yeah, and it then shows, it'll do the table. So if you just need to do a quick copy paste, you can do that. And then in the visual editor, and then what's interesting is when you turn it back, this is the markdown representation of a table. But you definitely don't want to have to mess with that individually, use little helper functions. And then I'm not going to go really into the references with Cider other than there's some nice ways that you can, like Zotero is a great bibliography manager for free, and you can visit the web version of any manuscript, any article, save it, and then export it in this like BibTeX format, and then use a little RStudio plugin to add in citations, and then this citation shows up like this. So that's the actual markdown version of the citation, and then it's Pandoc on the back end that then renders that citation and can even link it into from your citation to your bibliography at the end. So it's its own little beast to do this, but the Cider package makes it really nice and easy to do. Yeah. And then I'm just going to mention the BS Lib here. This is the Bootstrap Lib, and really it's for R Markdown and also Shiny, and that it can create a consistent theme for this stuff. And the default for Bootstrap, the default Bootstrap for R Markdown is Bootstrap 4. And there's some newer features like cards and things that are in Bootstrap 5. And a lot of the underlying style that you see on these websites is related to, like you can change all these color schemes really easily. And it uses this thing called Sass in the back end to actually use variables that then get rendered into the CSS. So this enables you to do that in a much more customizable way. So you can basically just update the YAML with a few options, install this BS Lib package, and then get a totally different look on your website. So yeah, I would encourage you to check that out if you want to play with the styling. And then with the little bit of time remaining, I just want to go over the quickest way to generate these formats, and then some of the tweaks that I think are most interesting with these techniques. So the quickest way to generate an R Markdown website is actually just to go File, New Project. So there are all these templates, and if you go and you start with a new directory, I can then use these templates. Like I can create a new project that is a Bookdown project, or a Distill website, or even just a simple R Markdown website. And let's say I'm just going to call this test simple website. Okay, and then we create this project inside. So this is actually going to create an rproj file inside this other R3 exercises. So that's not recommended, but just for the sake of demonstration. So you can see that here's the site YAML, that is the shared navigation. Here's the index, and we don't need to tell it what output type in this front matter, because the fact that we have this other site YAML, it handles that for us. It knows that it's supposed to be an HTML output. And then we can build the website, and we get my website. So that applies to a lot of stuff. We can use that simple templating to do that. We can, if it's more typically a single website, like we can look at a default file, e-file, and I think it's under R Markdown from template, and we can create a Flex dashboard and just the default type of that. And so this is, I'm going to save this as, oops, I'm going to close that and go back to my R3 exercises. And what I just created was that little test simple website. This is what we were looking at. And now, if I create a file, can do. So if it's generally multiple files, it would be a new project if you want to use a template. And if it's just a single file, then it's probably just this R Markdown. And then here we can go from template, and we can create a Flex dashboard. We say OK, and I can say test Flex dashboard, and we can save this. And then we can knit this, since this is a single file, and you can see that there's this different layout applied. Chart A, chart B, chart C. And the website has, the Flex Dashboard website has a lot more information about the details of that. This is the way, there's two different ways of saying header level 2, and this is the same. So there's no difference. You can use the underscores instead of this, but I prefer this. And then what I want to talk about then is like, well, what are all the tweaks to happen to make it to get to this place of using a parameterized report and then rendering with GitHub Action. Well, with the parameterized report, with this report website, so there's a lot here, like this make data basically goes and scrapes the website using this rvest. That's a whole other module we don't have time to go over. And it grabs the web page and then scrapes the table from it and then saves it to a CSV per indicator. So we get this data, Alaska, and then there's a little YAML actually that are the first 3 rows from that table that we can save to. And that's like metadata about each of the data sets. So this is the year value for that indicator. Okay, so there's this guy. And then we can make the pages. So this is the part, this is where the magic kind of happens. So if we have this data, and we have actually also in that data folder, we've got this overall table of all the indicators. What we can do is read that table in. So I can actually just read show you what that table looks like. And in this table we have a region and an index, and here's the data CSV. Here's where that data lives. And this is using that per. So normally with we use the map functions to return a value. If we're only interested in the side effects, we don't need a return value. We can use this walk. And then we can parallelize it. So the first argument of pwalk is a tibble. That's this. It's a list object. A tibble is actually a list object with the columns being list objects contained within. And then the second argument is a function that uses those named columns. And here we use these named columns to say, okay, here's the output HTML that we want. And this is then happening individually. So I can get inside of this, and so we can see what's happening when this renders. So I'm going to set a browser inside of this function so that we can actually see how it's working. All right, so it's what is index? Okay, it's NPI. What is region? Eastern Bering Sea. Name, North Pacific Index, data underscore CSV. Okay, so these are just values that were a single row of that data. And then from that, we had dir web was defined above, and the index. So this is the output file. And this R Markdown render, this is the workhorse of R Markdown rendering. And we can use this index RMD that we previously set. So index RMD is this underscore indicator. So this is the parameterized R Markdown. And what we see is that we can override these values, index region, index name, and the index CSV. And we do that by using the names that were fed in row by row of that tibble. So remember, the first argument was this tibble. And then this is going to walk through this little anonymous function and apply for each row in that tibble. It's going to pull out these values and then apply them here. And so what that ends up doing, we're inside this, it defines the parameters as this arbitrary list. So now these parameters are going to be this, this, and this. So that happens to be the first one, so it was those things anyway. So I will continue. Whoops. I messed up a path. Oh, because I actually ran this that path. This is from GitHub Action running it. So because we were using getting the full path when we made the data, GitHub Action ran it. So that doesn't work for this little example. But if I were to refetch everything and update those paths to where the CSV lives, then this would work. So I'm going to go and update the data. And now if we go and run this, it'll be relative to my machine, and this will then work. So now what is data CSV? So now it's relative to my machine, and does this file exist? True. So yeah, and now I can continue. It just rendered that again, and then this would be now the next iteration, and I can continue, and it would render that page as well, and I can stop there. So yeah, that's what renders all of these pages here to get that output. I know we're kind of over the hour, and I know it's kind of confusing. I want to say just one other thing with the GitHub action, and that's that it's using this GitHub action. So I can send this to the console, and this is what would override this. And actually, that'll be interesting because so it's going to update this to its default and overwrite the existing file. So if it didn't exist there, I wouldn't get this prompt. And I'm going to say yes. And what that'll also do is it'll allow us to see the differences between what the default was, which it just wrote, versus the original. So if you have a special hidden folder because it has a dot prefix, .github workflows, and then you have this guy in it. Here's, oh, it's weird. This looks like my modified version. I don't think it said override existing, but I don't think it did. Writing, GitHub workflows, ARM. Same. But basically, oh, here it is. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's now changed. Okay. So now, because of that, I should see this in my GitHub. There we go. Now I can look at the difference between what it created by default, which is in green, versus what I modified it to also have, which is in red. And basically, with the GitHub action, we can name it. So I added that. And then we can turn off the push. And this is, so when you push to GitHub, those are change files, and you can have an action occur whenever you push. And then I changed it also from what's in green here to only if there's a change in R Markdown to running that make data and the make pages and then re-rendering the index. And then it'll run that, and then it'll commit those changes with Git and then update the website. And then I also can turn on this workflow dispatch and set it to run once a month on a regular schedule. And so what that looks like, I just want to show you what that looks like online, is you get this, there's an actions tab, and here's our GitHub action, our workflow. So select workflow, render report website, and now we see all the history of this running, and this is a green, meaning that everything, there was no errors, and it was able to complete and update the website. We can also dispatch, because we had that option, we added a workflow dispatch in the YAML, and that means that we can run it arbitrarily just through the GitHub interface. And So now it's initiated, it's queued it, and it's in the build, and it's started, and now it's like kind of queuing it up. It's waiting for a runner. So it found a runner, meaning a machine to run it on. And then it goes through that job of actually updating it, loading all the software, etc. So I guess, yeah, that is a lot of stuff. Yeah. And I need to go back and clean up explanations of all this for you all. So apologies for being a little slapdash. But I hope you get at least a flavor of what's possible in doing this, and all the code is linked here. So yeah, with the source. So let's go ahead and look at the chat and see. And I guess maybe I'll show this other example. Here's another example of like a dashboard where I wanted to report out on like ship activity and if vessels were slowing down or not. So the Flex dashboard, here's a similar layout, but you can actually, the Flex dashboard has a gauge, and you can use icons and these color-coded boxes based on values. And then you can look at, this is its own dedicated page for that ship. And then this is just a little leaflet map and a gauge with the color-coded value and how well it's performing in this case of being the portion of segments that are below 10 knots versus above 10 knots. So yeah, you can do a lot with these little dashboards, and all this stuff so far is hosted for free and updatable for free. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna look at the chat, and Kim, feel free to jump in and prompt me with questions here too.
Yeah, looks like there's a couple that are unanswered. Does the browser work to show iterations in other ways, like loops? Question
mark. Okay. Yeah. So in that really is being what I was shown before about, let's see, this make pages. This is basically a loop. And it is a loop. It's iterating over each row in this table, and then it's setting these values. And actually, this is a good point to demonstrate. I use a similar technique, but an actual loop in the RMD website example. So if we look at the report website, and in the dashboard. So there's this make index. So it's actually doing a loop, and what it's doing is it starts with, close all this other stuff, and then I'll get inside that little loop to demonstrate the browser. So what it's creating this whole Flex dashboard, and the way it's doing that is this underscore. I underscore it just when you sort it, it tends to put it at the top. So I like that. This is the first part of this R Markdown, and eventually what we want to do is build up so that you have not only that part, but then you have a header for a region, and then all the indicators for that region. And so for me, just working through the logic, I found that actually running a loop is a little easier for me to think about. I could have done it like I did before with the pwalk, but this is actually doing the same thing as what pwalk is doing, and it's attaching that table. So let me run this. And so now I've just overwritten index.rmd. So it's just this precursor. So I read the lines from this underscore index.rmd and then overwrote whatever was the index.rmd. And now we're kind of basically starting fresh. And so we want to loop through each of those indicators, but we want to create, whenever we have a new region, we want to create that extra header. So something I'm going to do is keep track of, well, what was the previous region? And then if the region changes, then go ahead and write the header to that index. So let's go inside this loop. And I could have done browser here. And then it gets me inside that loop because the scope of variables changes. Or a lazy way to do it is, since a for loop has I and 1 to n row. So n row is the number of rows in this tibble, and that's 54. So then this 1 to that creates a vector. And then at each iteration, it sets the value of I to being whatever that is. So let's say I want to start at I equals 1. So the lazy way is just to set that. Now I'm basically in the loop, but I don't have to deal with scoping issues. And what you can do is slice that first row, so index of I. And there's this other little trick of you can attach it. So right now I don't have region is not found. But if I attach that first row, region is found. And so that's a little shortcut way of basically attaching all of the variables in that sliced row into this the variable scope space. So now I actually have a region, and I previously set it to blank, so this evaluates to true, and now I can go ahead and formulate this. So this is my header level 1, and then I can pipe that to a write command and be sure to append it as true. And now we see that we've appended this header level 1, and that'll be the tab at the top to go to that region. And then we want to set the region previous. So now region previous is Eastern Bering Sea. So it's the same as this region, and so that's false. So this will get ignored until the region changes. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to take this indicator expand as our little template. So, and we want to evaluate the name and that data CSV that we previously attached. So we can expand this, and it's kind of hard to see there. If I cat it out, you'll be able to read it more easily. But now this is North Pacific Index, so it's header level 3. And then here's our little code chunk that we've expanded, and we could just continue to write that out. So rather than concatenating it, we can just write this out. And now I've wrote my region, my index, and then I can just continue on. Like, let's say I want to now, well, what happens on the second indicator? Well, I reattach so that all those variables get reset. Region is still the same, so this is false and gets ignored. But what is net expand? What is that template now? Now it's CICE extent, and we have a different data table in. So we can write that out to the index.rmd. and now we've got another indicator in our Flex dashboard. So yeah, the browser, we could have done it that way, and so this is commented, so it's not going to evaluate, and I could say browser, and because I added a little message here, I'm actually going to see what index we're on. So now I can go ahead and run this and see it says browse, and it's at index NPI. So, and I can just hit return to continue, and I can see all the different indicators it's iterating through as I'm browsing. And it's basically building this guy up, and see we changed regions. So yeah, there's a lot of techniques here to get this stuff. Quite powerful. It's a little bit of a head scratcher to figure out how to do this. Took me a while to get to this stage, so hopefully you can get there sooner with some of these little tips. Yeah, I think that's good for that one. I can quit out.
Looks like there's with questions. Looks like it's a two-parter. Do you have any preference for when output for breaking up RMD files with many lines of code into multiple files? And the other question, and how headings get numbered in the table of contents.
Okay, so this is actually something you showed me, Kim, with the eco data. I was using that Perl thing. So I'm gonna reference that because that was kind of new to me. And the idea of breaking up RMD files. Okay. Well, maybe that Perl trick was a little different. So yeah, let me tackle that more generically. So when you have HTML output, you can have a lot of files, right? And you can just simply source when you have lots of files. So if I rerun this, like this is a big index.rmd with all of these things. Maybe what I have, maybe I just want to break this up by region. So maybe I just put all of this stuff into its own region. So I could take any chunks I want and go file, new file, and actually there's an even better way to do this. There's something called a child that you can use. That's probably the best way to do it. So what we can do is just take this whole thing, and a child is not meant to be run on its own. This is like the third of the, I would say, advanced techniques. And if we're in this report dashboard, maybe we just call it this one, like, we'll call it like _child EBS, Eastern Bering Sea .rmd. And what you can do here is you can insert a chunk, and let's call this our markdown child. And you'll see the documentation for it. So you can actually specify multiple children even. And now we can just say here, so in the main RMD, we specify which children we want. So we could just have a single vector value here. And let's see if this actually works. So I have this child EBS. So this is just a snippet of R Markdown, and I could then knit this Flex dashboard. And chart A. Okay, there it is. Yeah. So that still works. So this gives us back the goods, and that's probably the best way to kind of break it up. You could source the code, but that's only if it could be evaluated in a single chunk. If you have like a big run-on thing and you just want to chunk it out, you can use these. You can have children that you then include like this. So yeah, it's probably the best way to handle that one. So I was debating about that, sharing that, but I thought it's confusing because we also had the knit or expand method, and that we previously used with this guy. But it's a different strategy with a different technique. So in that case, we didn't actually change any variables. We just wanted to source a whole bunch of stuff that is in Markdown format. And in that case, that child document thing works pretty well.
And then the last part of that question was, do you have a good reference for how headings get numbered in the table of contents?
Okay, so yeah, it defaults to starting with 1. There is a little trick that I use for the R3 train website when doing this stuff, and that goes back to this pandoc. So you can actually offset the number of arguments here to 3. So right now we don't have, and then you can also unnumber things. So after a header, you can use curly braces to give it a class. And a class is an HTML thing that stylizes it. And you can give it a class of unnumbered. And that will make it prevent it from being numbered. And then we can actually have it's defaulting to numbered. And it's defaulting to numbered because in our site YAML, we specify these options. So the talk depth, talk flow, true. These get picked up by all R Markdown outputs, R Markdown files within that same folder. And so it's combining from that site YAML plus the front matter of this YAML. And let's just see what this offset 3 does by adding a few headers. So I'll be going into parameter, let's see, R Markdown website, and then with that example, I'll have below that, I'll go into parameterized R Markdown. And then I'll go into automatic generation with GitHub Action. And then another higher level on Flex dashboard. Okay, so if we knit this, we see that it started with 4 as header level 1. So the name of the page is the header level 1, and that's where it gets this. It gets it here. I actually ignored the typical title, but the page title is what you see when you go to like add a bookmark to this page. You see that it's called report, because I wanted to use header level 1 here, and then put that learning objectives. So notice that it's not numbered on learning objectives because it says unnumbered here. And then if you go down, this is numbering that floating talk it's incrementing starting above. And then it's, because it's header level 2, it's 4.1, and then this is header level 3, so then it increments within. So I like having the numbered headers because then you could quickly reference the section you're on and it's easier for other people to follow. Yeah. Any other burning questions, Kim? I know we're at the hour and a half.
No, I think you answered everything from the chat. Other folks were answering each other's questions, so I think that covers all the questions for today. Awesome.
Okay, well, I have a bunch of cleanup to do on the website to do a better job explaining. Apologies for the lag there, but I will have time to do that before next time. And also there at the end we'll have a little quiz that we'll send out to everybody, just asking you for suggestions about how to better structure this in the future, and you know, what you got out of it, what was most useful and what was least useful. So yeah, we'll have that at the end, and I'll email everybody with that stuff. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time for we're going to talk about interactive infographics. So this is some custom libraries that we made to link icons in an ecosystem or in integrated ecosystem assessment language, a conceptual diagram of an ecosystem with the indicators associated with them. And this could be generically used for a lot of data-driven storytelling. So I look forward to sharing with you on that. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks.